This is a high-performance electric motorcycle that I built in my garage. And by high performance, I mean 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds, a top speed of 145 miles an hour, a range of between 160 and 200 miles depending on how I ride it, and simply put, it's the best handling motorcycle I've ever ridden. So in this video, I want to show you how I built it, tell you why I picked the components I did, and how you can build your own at home. I'm Alex Grieve, and this is Higher Voltage. So one of the first questions people ask me is, what kind of motor is that? This is a Netgain Hyper 9 brushless DC motor. Now when it comes to electric vehicles, you have three types of motors: the AC induction motor, the series wound DC motor, or the brushless DC motor. I chose the brushless DC for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it's the most efficient of the motor types. While all the motors are very efficient nowadays, the brushless DC overall seems to be the most efficient, and that's possibly because of the other reason I chose it. It has the capability of regenerative braking. That means when I apply the brakes, I can choose to have this slow down the motorcycle and use that energy to charge my batteries. Now the way I hooked it up is I actually did it on my clutch lever because electric vehicles, well, they don't need a gearbox. And as you can see, this motor is directly coupled to the drive shaft that spins my rear tire. So there's actually no transmission. It is simply a direct drive. This motor is capable of 88 kilowatts, and that equates to about 120 horsepower. But it's kind of tough to compare an electric motor to a gas engine. And the reason is a gas engine produces more power as the engine speeds up, whereas a DC motor has an approximately flat torque curve until it speeds up. In other words, this thing loses power after it gets to a certain speed. This motor puts out 173 pound-feet of torque to this shaft, which in the back I've got a 3.4 to 1 gearbox, and that equates to about 500 pound-feet of torque to that rear wheel with losses. This thing takes off like it was shot out of a cannon, and it's a heck of a lot of fun. And the nice thing about an electric motor is the instant you twist the throttle, boom, instant acceleration. The power is instantaneous. So that's not something you're going to get from a gas motor. And the other thing, of course, is it happens silently. You'll hear a whir, and that's about it. And that whir is coming from the gears back there. So how much power do you really need for a motorcycle? Well, 88 kilowatts is absolutely overkill. It's way more than this bike can handle, which makes it a lot of fun, actually. The original motor I wanted to put in it was actually a 20 kilowatt, which suddenly became unavailable when I attempted to buy it. And, well, this one showed up in my search engine about half an hour later, and I decided, well, why not go for broke and put the biggest motor any sane person would put in a motorcycle of this size. And so this is actually a 35 kilowatt motor. Though, wait, didn't I just say 88? Well, yeah, because 88 is the peak power of this motor. The nominal power, or how much this motor is designed to sustain, is about 35 kilowatts. So how much of that am I actually using? Well, at highway speeds, at 70, 60, 70 miles an hour, it's somewhere around 5 or so kilowatts. So I'm not using anywhere near the capability of this motor. So the next question I get asked is, what batteries am I using? Well, I chose a chemistry called lithium iron phosphate. Now this is a 36 cell, 120 amp hour battery. And that equates to about 14 kilowatt hours worth of power. In other words, to charge this bike up, it costs about $1.25 worth of electricity, and it goes 160 miles. So that's pretty darn efficient. That's pretty far on a charge. Now, why did I choose lithium iron phosphate of all the lithium chemistries? Well, it has a few advantages. First of all, these batteries have the longest life. Lithium iron phosphate can last 12 to 15 years, as opposed to lithium ion or lithium polymer, which typically have a life expectancy somewhere between 6 and 8 years. Think about your cell phone. How long is the battery good for? Maybe 2 years? That's a lithium ion battery. But if you look at vehicles nowadays, especially motorcycles, their 12-volt battery, which, yes, this is the 12-volt battery here, this is lithium iron phosphate as well. And my lithium iron phosphate batteries in my motorcycles are going on 8 years and still going strong. So from just a longevity perspective, I expect this bike to have these batteries in it for 12 to 15 years before I would actually have to change them out. The other advantage to lithium phosphate is it's not flammable. Lithium ion and lithium polymer are extremely flammable. In fact, if you go online and look up lithium battery fire, you'll see a lot of videos of different things, especially hoverboards, catching fire due to their batteries literally exploding. And the last thing I want to have is a bomb go off under my seat while I'm attempting to ride this motorcycle down the road. So from a flammability perspective and stability perspective, the lithium iron phosphate is the best. However, it is heavier. It's about 15 to 20% heavier, so I did take a weight penalty for that. Now there is another advantage to lithium iron phosphate. You can beat the living snot out of them. So typically when you're sizing a battery for an electric vehicle, you do not want to exceed a discharge current of twice your battery's capacity. So since these are 14 kilowatt hours worth of batteries, typically I would choose a motor no more than 28 kilowatts. And as I said earlier, this is an 88 kilowatt motor. So why would I do that? Well, the great thing about lithium phosphate is you can absolutely beat the snot out of them. So most batteries are rated in what they call the C rating. That is, how many times in an hour could the battery discharge its full capacity? So 1C at 120 amp hour battery would be 120 amps. These are rated at 3C, so they are rated for 360 amps apiece. However, this motor takes 750. And considering I've blown that master fuse several times, and that's a 600 amp fuse in there, they can push well past that comfortably. And I've got several charges on these, and they do not seem to be losing capacity, despite how hard I'm beating on them. So I am definitely a big fan of lithium iron phosphate, but if you want a lighter battery that has some good performance, but not quite as heavy as lithium iron phosphate, look into lithium cobalt manganese. It's a lot lighter, it's not quite as flammable as lithium ion or lithium polymer, and it's got a pretty good discharge. But again, unless you're going with lithium iron phosphate, you do not want to choose a motor that's peak power is more than double your battery's capacity, because you will eventually damage the batteries. Although these things, they're incredible, and they can take it. Okay, so this is what the other side of the electric motorcycle looks like. And one of the first things you might notice is the batteries are sticking out here on the side a lot more than they were on this side. You might wonder, well, what's that about? Well, what it's about is balance. Batteries are heavy, but they're nowhere near as heavy as the electric motor I have on the other side of the bike. So in order to counterbalance it and make sure the center of gravity of the motorcycle stayed in line with the vehicle, I had to add extra batteries over to the side in order to counterbalance the weight of that motor. And that's really critical. When you're building a motorcycle, you want to be sure that your balance is correct, not only side to side, but also front to back. And you might notice these boxes back here that each hold 4 batteries on either side. And the reason for that is because I didn't want the bike to be too front heavy. When I was building it, I noticed the front end was getting excessively heavy, a lot heavier than the gas engine was originally. Even though these forks are from a much heavier machine, I didn't want all the weight to be on the front end, so I simply moved some of it back and ran some heavy cables. And yeah, I even snuck one battery here under the seat. But the reason I pushed to the side again is to keep the center of balance straight down the line of the bike so it didn't want to fall to one side at low speed. Okay, so now that I've shown you the other side of the bike, I'll show you some of the other components you need to build your own electric motorcycle that are under this cowl and under the seat. Okay, with the cowl removed, we can see a lot more components down here in the motorcycle rather than just the batteries and the motor.
And one of the first things you might notice is that I've got this stuff up here. Now, this right here is the motor controller. That is what actually controls the big brushless DC motor. You can't just hook it direct to a battery, you need a controller. Now, most motors come with their own controller, and it's probably best just to go with whatever the manufacturers suggest for that style of motor. But just to give you an idea, my motor weighs 125 pounds, and that controller might weigh about 12 pounds. But the controller is going to need a few inputs from you, and that is, number one, of course, throttle. And that's what this is right here. This is just a potentiometer that's run to my throttle cable, so that when I twist my throttle, it pulls a cable and runs it just like a motorcycle would run a carburetor, but instead it's just a potentiometer. But this over here is a little bit different. I told you I had a regenerative brake, but while they recommend that I use a pressure transducer, that is, as I apply force onto the brakes, there'd be a pressure valve that would push and run the regenerative brake, I kind of like the idea of not using my brakes at all and just using straight electricity. So, considering that I don't need a gearbox, I hook my clutch lever here up to a scooter potentiometer. And as in scooter, as in yes, that is a throttle for a mobility scooter. So that's all that is when I pull my clutch, it pulls the potentiometer and it tells the controller how much power I want to regenerate and therefore how much I want to brake. Now you might have noticed I pulled my hand back pretty quick because I just got zapped because I forgot to do this. That's a maintenance switch. So anytime you expose this, you probably ought to throw it to the off position, because what I had touched inadvertently was the master contactor. That's this. So the bike doesn't always have power, it goes through a master contactor. But before it gets to this, hidden under here is, as I had said earlier, a 600 amp fuse. Now, you know my motor takes 750 amps. Why a 600 amp fuse? Well, fuses have a thermal curve, and an 800 amp is just too much. For a 750 amp peak amp motor, the 600 amp fuse seems to be just about right. So anyway, power will go from the battery through the fuse and then through the maintenance switch. So now everything past the maintenance switch is now dead. And then it goes here to the master contactor, and that is what's responsible to turn on the high voltage to the rest of the system. That is the motor controller and the motors, and then this thing down here. And this silver box is another component you're going to need. This silver box hidden down here is what's called a battery management system, or BMS, and it is responsible for maintaining the batteries, or managing it, as the name would suggest. You can see these small wires that go to each individual cell. And if you're wondering what those are balance wires. So what the BMS does is it makes sure that every battery is charged up to the same level. Because if I have a very strong or a very weak cell, I'm likely to damage that cell or other cells in the battery if I don't manage them properly. And that's the purpose of the BMS, to make sure all the batteries have the same level of charge. So let's say I'm nearing the end of my battery, let's say one battery is basically dead. Well, if I over discharge it, I'll damage the battery and I'll have to replace it. So the BMS prevents that from happening. It also regulates my charger. Now, what about the charger? Well, that's this box back here. It's a built-in charger. This is a 1.8 kilowatt charger that runs on AC 110 or 220 volts. Now, at 110 volts from dead flat, it takes about 14 hours to charge this bike. That's because this only does about 800 watts in a 14 kilowatt hour battery. But on 220, it charges it up in approximately 6 hours. So yeah, I can plug this into any wall outlet and charge it up. But of course, I've got a welding outlet near the exit to my garage, so if I want to charge it up fairly quick, I can charge it up in approximately 5 to 6 hours from dead flat. Now, typically I don't run it dead flat, and it only takes about 2 hours to charge up from daily use. So I wouldn't worry too much about charge times when you're talking about a motorcycle, but of course, I could have got a lot bigger charger that can charge it up a lot faster. This is just the smallest charger that I could find, because I wanted something I could permanently mount on the motorcycle so I could charge it any place I want. Now, another thing you might have noticed is this black box right here. This is a DC to DC converter, and every electric vehicle is going to need it because if you try to put 120 volts to the motorcycle's 12-volt system, it's going to destroy it. So this steps down the 120 volts of my battery to 12 volts for the rest of my electronics. That is my brake light, turn signals, headlight, horns, that kind of stuff. So I could have used the bike's standard wiring harness, but the truth is most of it is there to maintain the ignition and charging system that was for the gas engine. So I ripped it out and rewired it all myself. Now, I did this for two reasons. One, it just cuts down the number of wires, even though my wiring job isn't the best. But the other reason is I wanted a floating ground frame. Most vehicles use their frame as the ground reference, and I didn't want to do that. And the reason for that is if the insulation of the batteries gets punctured somewhere, and I find another fault, that is another short to the frame, I can get shocked from that. And you can see, even though these are hot, I can touch these with no problem. Why can I touch these bus bars? No problem. Well, because it takes two connections to make a circuit. And when I had touched it here, well, it went through my hand, through this wire to the controller, which is how it found ground, which is how I got zinged. Is that dangerous? Yeah, it's dangerous. In fact, if you're working on this, you notice that I'm careful when messing with this stuff to only touch those components with one hand, and that way the electricity doesn't go through my heart. Does it hurt? It does. Not terribly, and more surprise you than anything else. But it is dangerous, so if you're going to maintain and work on this kind of stuff, use insulated tools and be very careful. Yeah, I'm a little bit reckless. I've been shocked more times than I care to think about, so use me as a bad example. Okay, a couple final notes for anybody interested in converting a motorcycle to electric power. Number one, choose a bike you like. The last thing you want to do is spend hours and hours and thousands of dollars converting a motorcycle to electric that you're never going to ride. These are driving machines. They are not showpieces. And they are fantastic at doing just that. They are a great, smooth, comfortable ride. So if you're a cruiser type, get a cruiser. If you're a sport bike type, build a sport bike. Me, I like standards because they're somewhat comfortable, they're sporty, they've got a good bit of performance, they kind of do everything well, and that's what I tend to enjoy, so that's what I converted to electric. One thing to note though is you're going to expect the bike to get heavier than the original. I'm not sure how much this weighed off the factory floor, but I'm guessing it was somewhere around 420, 425 pounds or so. Well, my batteries weigh 240 pounds. My motor weighs 125 pounds. And by the time you factor in the motor controller, all the wiring, cabling, battery management system, charger, and all that kind of stuff, the electric power system weighed just about as much as the original motorcycle did. And then I still got all the frame components. So this bike weighs in somewhere between 540 to 560 pounds by my best estimate. That's a good bit heavier than the original. And that's why, well, if you know the Honda Sabre, this was a 700 Sabre, but that front end is from an 1100 Sabre. So I took the front end out of a heavier bike to support the added weight. Now, when I did that, I went ahead and replaced the head bearings with tapered roller bearings, because I don't know what they were thinking when they put ball bearings in the headset of a motorcycle, but it's one of the dumbest things motorcycle manufacturers did in the 80s, is put ball bearings in there, because they make the steering jerky over time, and it just doesn't handle well. Speaking of handling, the next thing you want to upgrade is the suspension. Most motorcycles have suspension that leaves a lot to be desired. And so I upgraded the rear shock on this bike with a Hagon. Hagon out of the UK actually made a shock for this, and I told them I wanted a heavier spring rate to deal with the added weight. And so I had a Hagon shock with a 200 rate spring. I forget what units that's in. But it typically would take a 160, but because of the added weight, I asked for a 200, and that worked out great. Of course, I upsized the front end for the added weight, and I put thicker fork oil in there, again, for added weight. Now, I could get a shock from Icon as well. I've got several Icon shocks on my bikes, and they make a great shock as well. It's just I wanted to try Hagon, and I'm glad I did. It rides great. And you might say, well, isn't suspension overrated? No. You just smoothed out this bike, took
all the vibration out of it and you made it just the power system smooth as glass. Might as well make the suspension system work with it. So that's what makes this bike such a fantastic ride. It's not just the smooth, instantaneous power delivery of the electrical system, but it's a good suspension system working in harmony with it. And the other thing is, when I go and carve up those mountain roads, that smoothness has this incredible connected feel. That's the one thing about an electric motorcycle. As much as some people say, oh, you're destroying a perfectly good machine, I disagree. The level of connection I feel on this bike compared to any other is just marvelous. I feel like more part of this machine than any other bike I've ever ridden. I feel so confident carving up the mountains or stopping in an emergency situation, more so on this bike than any other. And despite its weight, it's probably the easiest bike to ride that I've ever sat on. So with that, guys, that is what I put into my electric motorcycle and how I build it. I'm Alex Grieve, and this is Higher Voltage.